think it finally feels like a final days day today. Now, I know there's not a lot of lower fruit than this, although that kind of applies to everyone I've responded to this year. I do think, though, that of all the channels I've looked at, this one's among the more important to talk about, because believe it or not, there apparently are quite a few people who buy into this. This channel has 25,000 subscribers, and regularly gets about 150% of that in views, meaning 30-some thousand. It seems that the number of people who are so unfamiliar with the basic functionality of cameras and digital images, and who are so obsessed with the Bible to the point that seeing perfectly ordinary images throws them into a panic about the end of the world is kind of amazing. If there was ever a decent argument for photography classes in schools, I guess this would be it. Much more importantly though, I still consistently get a bigger laugh out of this channel than any other channel, so I just want to. I hope you're in the mood for some lens flares. If you're not, just leave me thousands of profane negative comments.
Call centers were actually hired to leave thousands of profane negative comments in order to discredit the channel, thanks to your tax dollars.
So what are we looking at today?
Today we will be viewing striped and heavily cratered celestial objects rolling across the sky, and several other sky and space anomalies not mentioned in mainstream news.
Well, that's unexpected. What a nice change of pace. Seriously though, I'll try to cut out anything I've looked at before that I don't have anything new to say about or that isn't kind of different. Or I'll keep it in if I think it's fun. Whatever. But don't worry, I'm not just going to be talking about old stuff. I picked this particular video because it has some interesting extras. Oh, and for anyone who hasn't seen the first two videos, the fake sun and the looming lens flare planets, and the fake sun and the airport yeti, you do well to go look at those first, because I reproduced a lot of these effects in those videos, and I'm not going to repeat those demos here. If necessary, I might put in clips of the original demos, I don't know. But even beyond those demos, some of what I'm going to say here will assume that you've seen those other videos, because I don't want to be spending all my time repeating myself. So I'll link to those in the description.
The purpose of this channel is to show the viewers that we are living in the very last days according to the Holy Bible, and to explain why this is very good news and cause for celebration.
I've always kind of wondered which direction your reasoning went on that. Did you just randomly find yourself looking at FAA weather cams one day and you started seeing a bunch of lens flares and glare and dust specks and black spots on sensors and so on, and you just couldn't think of how to explain it, and so you started trying to figure out some grand unified theory of dust specks and decided the best fitting explanation had to be that the vague predictions of signs in the sky from the Bible are coming true? Or did you start off a hardcore Bible believer thinking you must be living in the end times, please God let me be living in the end times, unlike all those people through the past 2,000 years who thought the exact same thing you think, and so you started hunting around for signs in the sky in crappy weathercam digital photos, instead of in the actual sky for some reason, all in the desperate hope of finding anything you could interpret as a sign. Critical thinking be damned. I'm guessing it was one of those, and I have my guess as to which one it was, and I'd bet pretty heavily I'm right. But I'd actually love to ask you directly. A live stream, or even just a private chat just to ask some questions would be pretty great. There's a lot of things I'm curious about regarding this vast global fake sun conspiracy version of Christianity that so many of the videos I've replied to this year are based on. But unfortunately, you seem to make yourself pretty hard to contact. There's no private messages on YouTube anymore, you have comments turned off, so I don't really see a way to ask you my questions directly. Oh well.
Many of you have seen this celestial object, which is orbiting Earth, hundreds of times from many different cameras in Alaska and Canada.
And sometimes in a bunch of weather cams at once, putting it at totally different locations. What an incredible celestial object.
The reason we are starting out with this footage is to remind viewers of some fundamental rules of lens flares.
Can we start with the fundamental rules of real planets?
1. A lens flare of the sun doesn't rotate.
Right. At least if you mean rotating on an axis like a planet, yeah, right. And since there's no sign of it rotating, it's consistent with the lens flare so far. Sure, the sky's changing color under it, clouds are moving by behind it, there are plenty of compression artifacts coming and going essentially at random, but there's no sign of any repeating pattern that would hint that this is a rotating sphere.
A lens flare of the sun is a small reflection of the sun, which rotates only once every 27 Earth days.
Doesn't matter if it rotates at all. The sun is way too bright, and the quality of these images is way too poor to see detail on the sun like you would through a solar filter.
2. Lens flares of the sun do not have craters.
I agree, and given that there's absolutely no sign of craters, it's still consistent with a lens flare. You remember when I said there are no repeating patterns that'd hint it's a rotating sphere? Well, that's true, but there are some repeating patterns. The coarse DCT basis patterns that comprise each square, because this is a JPEG image compressed to a ludicrous degree, probably to save bandwidth and storage costs. You'll notice that these patterns, which are what you're mistaking for craters, continue all across the image. They're not confined to the lens flare. And you'll also notice, if you look carefully, there is no planet-wide repeating pattern of those square patterns relative to each other. If these are really craters on a planet that's spinning, you should be seeing the same craters in the same spots over and over and over. But you're not, because this is just compression. All you're seeing is a bunch of squares that represent as well as possible whatever happens to be in that bit of the image in the current frame, so the pattern in each spot is going to constantly change, for all intents and purposes at random.
3. Sun lens flares can never go behind clouds or other objects in a photo or video.
If you saw something that looked like a lens flare, but it was being clearly and unambiguously eclipsed by something in the sky, then yeah, you would have to reconsider what you're looking at. But there's no sign of that here. The visibility of parts of the lens flare is affected by the changing color and brightness of the background underneath it, or by the original light source, the sun, being obscured, which might make the flare look like it's partially obscured even if there are no clouds in sight. But there's no indication here that a cloud is getting between us and the lens flare. Be careful not to misinterpret what you're looking at just because you want to. Advice I'm sure won't be followed, since your goal seems to be to misinterpret everything you see as much as possible.
4. Lens flares of the sun can never react to sunlight in a video. For example, a lens flare cannot become partially illuminated by the object causing the lens flare.
Meaning, for example, that you wouldn't see half of it lit by sunlight and half of it in shadow like the moon? I agree. So we have yet another way this is perfectly consistent with a lens flare. You see how the sky has a color gradient? Well, that's showing clearly through the lens flare. The apparent brightness of different parts of the lens flare always conform to the background color of the sky, and it never looks lit from the side or silhouetted from the back, even though if it's really in the sky, the sun would be behind and beside it throughout this video.
Please remember these elementary facts as we go through these FAA videos.
I'll be sure to do that, thank you. I didn't expect you to lay out half my case for me, but yeah, thanks.
NASA's equipment is much, much closer to the Earth than the Sun. This is why the sun often appears to cast two different reflections in the water, such as seen on the east-facing camera at Taku Inlet, Alaska.
Oh, I see. Wait, if the sun simulator's close, it casts two reflections. Why? Why does not being a real sun make something cast two reflections? Or are you trying to say something like the real sun's at a totally different point above the horizon and we just can't see it? In which case, if it's casting that much light, why wouldn't we see it? I'm not following your reasoning here, if you have any. Anyway, as usual, you've mistaken a property of an object that reflects light, in this case the surface of some water instead of the inside of a camera lens, for a property of the object that produced the light. For some reason, you think an explanation like, there are two suns, one of which is not visible, but produces a reflection, like a reverse vampire, is a simpler explanation than the water's a little bit more or less ripply in different places. And I say ripply because here's what's actually happening. In more rippled sections of water, the sun glitters more off the tops of the little waves. That's what you see happening in the distance right in front of the mountains. The light from the sun, that if this were a perfectly flat mirror-like surface would just reflect away at the wrong angle for us to see it, instead reflects off at odd angles from the little waves, which obviously have surfaces at all different angles, and in some places reaches the camera. In the smoother areas, though, the water acts more like a flat mirror. If you look carefully at the water, you can easily see that there's a difference in the surface texture of the water in different areas. Really close to us and really far away from us, the water looks more light gray, but in the middle, where that glitter path disappears, the water looks almost black. Not so much here, where what you have to reflect are more distant, lighter-looking mountains and the sky, but certainly to either side of that. And that's because, where it's a little bit wavier, you're getting reflections off those odd angles on the surface from all over the place. And most of all over the place is the sky, which is pretty light. But in the smoother sections, it's much more effectively reflecting those silhouetted, almost black-looking mountains. Here's a really similar effect, but with a bit more variety in what's being reflected. Notice how the smoother surface reflects the buildings really well, making the water, where they're reflected, a lot darker than in the rippled areas. But between the buildings, it's reflecting the sky a lot better, making it look brighter than the ripply areas. If those mountains weren't there in our picture and it was just sky, that's what we'd be seeing in those smoother sections of water. And like I said, that's why that area just to the left of the glitter path looks so bright compared to the rest of the smooth water. There's a gap there between the really dark looking mountains. Closer to our camera, where the glitter path comes back, the narrow part is just the same effect of rippled water that we saw before, but you see that towards the very, very bottom, it starts widening out a lot more. And that's because if you could tilt the camera down, you'd see that that's where the real reflection of the sun is. If the water was all a flat mirror, that's where the correct location of the sun would be. And I can sort of show you that by roughly cutting out the reflections of the mountains, which is a little bit tricky since the reflection of their tops on the right side is a little bit messed up by the ripply water. So when I say cutting it out out roughly, I mean roughly. Then I'll mess with the colors a little bit to make them more visible, flip it vertically, and reduce the opacity so you can see the original mountains with the reflected mountains on top. And now you'll notice that that wide bottom area of the glitter path is approaching where the actual sun in the middle of all that glare should be. And in the preceding frames you showed us, we can actually see the reflection of the sun, of course with some glare around it, moving down into that position as the sun rises. This stuff, looking for the glitter path, looking for interruptions in it, stuff like that, is common knowledge that's been used since the distant past to determine the conditions on the surface of water. This is nothing new, but somehow despite its incredibly long history, it comes as a surprise to you. I honestly don't get how you manage to pay that little attention to the world around you.
This equipment is capable of producing a circular glare, thousands of miles in diameter.
Wow, what a coinkydink. Cameras at high exposure are capable of making that exact same kind of glare. That's so weird. We've been over all that before, though. We can do something more interesting.
However, whenever it passes behind a narrow object, such as this thin flagpole, it completely disappears. Our real sun could never disappear behind a thin flagpole.
You serious right now, dude? You're gonna make me do the light pole all over again with a flagpole? What is it with you and poles? Well, okay, here we go. So obviously we all know that whether anything can be hidden behind something else depends on the apparent size of both of the objects, which is a function of both real size and distance. By which I mean if there's a pencil 100 meters away, it's hardly going to block out anything you're seeing, but if you hold it right in front of your eyeball, it'll block out pretty much anything. This is what you might like to call a
fundamental rule.
And it's not one you disagree with, even if you might think so. It's one you recognize and operate based on every single day. It'd be pretty hard, for example, to walk or drive your car if you didn't intuitively comprehend it. So it should go without saying, and yet you consistently forget it whenever any type of pole enters the frame of a picture. Having said that, though, of course that doesn't debunk what you're saying. So is the flagpole actually close enough to hide the sun, or is it not, and therefore you might have a point? Well, from the airport code, CYDB, we can find out that this is the Burwash Airport in the Yukon. We don't need to know anything else to do this the easy way. All we need to do is compare this image of the west-facing weather cam with the reference image helpfully provided by Nav Canada, because the reference image helpfully tells us what angles we're looking at. Now, the camera's been turned slightly since the reference image was taken, but the field of view is still the same and the flagpole looks about the same size, so it doesn't matter. We'll overlay the reference image on your image and then duplicate the flagpole a whole bunch of times to find out how wide it is. This 30-degree section is about 36 flagpoles wide, making the pole just under a degree wide in the image. If the sun's angular size is 30 arc minutes, or half a degree, then just from this we can tell that the flagpole is plenty wide enough to hide the sun. And that's without even taking into consideration the fact that the pole gets wider the lower you go, and that the folded up blue tip of the Yukon flag means that it's not just the width of the flagpole that can hide the sun here, but actually more like double that width. So that's the easy way to figure out that the flagpole is plenty wide enough to hide the sun, and I'd be entirely right to call it done and move on now. But you gotta remember, this is Logicked, and this is a pole. We don't do poles the easy way. So let's do it the hard way and double check our work. Here's every useful picture I found of the terminal building at Burwash Airport so we can figure out what we're really looking at. This one is the most interesting, I would say, because we can actually see the weather cam. It's not too relevant right now, but at least I'll know the kind of thing to look for if I ever need to know about Canadian weather cams for some reason. Now from this we can see that the thing in the upper left corner is the corner of the roof. To get an idea of the width of a typical flagpole, the flag store has flagpoles that vary from a constant 2 3/8 inch wide to a tapered pole that goes from 3 inches at the base to 1.75 inches at the top. These are 20 to 25 foot poles, which is a very normal height, and it also looks about right. The telescoping pole is more like what we're looking at. You can actually see the rings or joints or whatever you call those. I'm not up on my telescoping pole terminology, sorry. So let's call the width somewhere between the width at the top and the width at the bottom, say 2.5 inches where it covers the sun. Here are some images with the flagpole and the building in the same picture so we can get a general idea of how far away the pole is from the camera. Now, the typical Canadian flag you would fly on one of these poles is 6 feet long, and I think it's very generous to guess from this that the flag is at most 20 feet away from the camera. Personally, I'd say that's way too high of an estimate, which is good because I want to give you as much of an advantage as I can. If you think it's too low of an estimate, I don't know what to tell you. Find a way to measure precisely and put it in the comments, I guess. Prove me wrong, same as usual. Now all we gotta do is punch those rough numbers into our angular size calculator, and remember, the sun, not the glare that you see in the camera when you look at it, but the angular size of the sun itself, which you can easily see through a solar filter you can get for like $10 on Amazon, you have no excuse, is about half a degree. So an object 20 feet or 240 inches away and 2.5 inches wide will subtend about 0.6 degrees. So just on its own, that would be just big enough to hide the sun. And when we include the width of the flag that about doubles that size, it's even more comfortable. If I were to guess just from looking at the picture, seeing where the center of the still visible glare seems to be, I would say the sun probably isn't just behind the flagpole. It's probably partly hidden by the pole and partly by the flag. You can see quite a lot of light coming through the much less opaque single layer of white, and you can see just how much light gets cut out just by folding that white part over on itself once. It's pretty significant, and the blue part, being darker and folded over a couple times like it is considerably more opaque than that. So there you go, that's the hard way, and I have to say it wasn't anywhere near as hard as the Drumheller light pole. I'm a little disappointed. Wait, whoa! Why is the sun making multiple reflections?
To find out where the real sun went, please watch our March 23rd video.
But I already know where it went. Oh, whatever, let's do it. I'm in a poley mood. I want to stay on your pole all day.
The reason this is happening is because the light source we are viewing is the glare produced by the black dot equipment that reflects upon the water surface.
A lot of what you're seeing is glare, I'll give you that. The unavoidable fact of glare is why it's a really good idea to use a solar filter if you want to see the real size of the sun, and why it's so unbelievably stupid that you constantly say the sun is giant when you see a bunch of glare. Of course, the point of these weather cams is not to measure the angular size of the sun, that's not their purpose, so nobody really cares what the sun looks like. Unfortunately, that lack of caring and thus lack of implementation of solutions for glare has the side effect of leading unbelievably incompetent image analysts to proclaim that the sun must be fake because they confuse glare with the sun itself.
Where's the real sun?
Behind the pole and the flag, just where you'd expect.
It is currently behind a dark nebula that we will be looking at in just a minute.
No, we won't. We're going to finish the flagpole, then end the video.
To refresh your memory on the approximate size of the real sun, here is an inset of the real sun we just saw moments ago in Portage Glacier. The real sun could never be hidden behind a thin flagpole.
Oh, so is that why it's in front of the flagpole then? I mean, if we're denying that glare exists in this picture and saying the entire thing here is the real sun, then apparently the sun is between us and the flagpole, right? That's not just glare coming around the edges, that's the sun. Is that what you think? Are you sure you've thought this through to the end? Alright, well, we've got plenty more stuff to look at and some very interesting revelations about the Final Days' previous YouTube channel, Universal News Media, which is the one I first responded to, and why that channel ended. But I'm going to leave that stuff for the next part because this is a really good point to pause before that starts. I want to give a massive thanks to all the supporters of this channel on Patreon, Subscribestar, PayPal, Paywhirl, any other method, you're the best. If you like the video, give it a like. If you don't know how cameras work, give it a dislike. Subscribe if you want to catch part 2. Sign up to my email list at list.logicked.com for early access. Join my Discord, and don't forget to feed your cat. See you in part 2.